The chalk snapped in half as Dr. Carrington laughed. Maybe stick to mopping floors, Malik. Calculus isn't for janitor's kids. The courtyard froze. Students whispered. Some smirked. Malik stared at the equation on the board. Heart racing, humiliated, burning. Then, slowly, he picked up the chalk and stepped forward. What happened next silenced Harvard. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The hallway of Hawthorne Hall, one of Harvard University's oldest academic buildings, was unusually quiet that Thursday morning. Its high-arched ceilings and oil-rubbed oak panels bore witness to generations of privilege. The thick silence was broken only by the occasional squeak of a maintenance cart rolling along the marble floor. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Morning lectures hadn't yet begun, and only a few early risers passed through, heads down, minds set on midterms. Yet for Malik Simmons, every footstep echoed like a countdown. His fingers gripped the handle of his mother's janitorial cart as he pushed it forward with silent obedience, trying to disappear into the background. Malik didn't belong here. Not officially, not according to them. His mother, Angela Simmons, had cleaned these halls for 12 years, longer than most students or staff had been around. And for the last 3 years, since his father passed, Malik had joined her during early morning shifts before school, trading sleep for silence, ambition for invisibility. But invisibility was never permanent in a place like this, especially not for someone like him. Brown skin, worn hoodie, beat-up sneakers. He was more of a stain than a presence to some, and that morning someone decided to remind him. Dr. William Carrington, tenured professor of applied mathematics and departmental darling, walked out of his office with the lazy arrogance of someone who believed the universe conspired in his favor. His corduroy blazer matched his attitude, rumpled but unapologetically elite, a slim latte in one hand, a leather satchel in the other. He stopped just inches from Malik, surveying him with the kind of casual disdain that doesn't need to be loud to be violent. "Still trailing your mother's mop, huh?" Carrington murmured, sipping from his cup. His voice was low, but the venom in his tone was unmistakable, designed to cut without drawing blood. "Tell me, do they let you audit classes now if you sweep quietly enough?" Malik's jaw tensed. He kept his head down, choosing dignity over defiance. But his silence only fed Carrington's hunger. "Or perhaps you've decided to challenge yourself with some real knowledge," the professor continued, tilting his head toward a calculus textbook lying open on the bench across from them. "Likely forgotten by a student in a rush. No offense, but I doubt you'd get past the cover. You strike me more as someone who thinks Integral is a shampoo brand." The laughter wasn't loud, not from Carrington, and certainly not from the few students who had stopped to eavesdrop, but it echoed like thunder to Malik, rattling the walls of his pride. The insult wasn't just intellectual, it was generational. It was the kind of wound that didn't bleed, but burned from the inside. Malik's heart pounded, but he kept his eyes fixed on the mop handle. He had learned this posture, this survival from years of watching his mother take subtle humiliations in stride. She'd taught him not to let rich men's words define his worth, but she hadn't taught him what to do when they were this bold, this intentional, this cutting. Carrington's smirk lingered. He leaned in slightly, as if preparing to deliver one final blow. "Then again, maybe we should give you a chance. Tell you what, solve the first problem in that book, and I'll personally recommend you to the admissions board. But don't break your head trying. It's real math, not mop algebra." And just like that, he walked off. No grand scene, no confrontation, just a quiet, surgical incision delivered with Ivy League precision. Malik stood frozen, the hallway pressing in around him. The students who had watched the exchange began to move again, their expressions ranging from discomfort to dismissal. One of them, a lanky junior with wireframe glasses, muttered "damn" under his breath as he passed, not in sympathy but in amusement. Malik didn't respond. He couldn't. Something inside him had shifted. The calculus textbook remained open on the bench a few feet away. Its pages fluttered slightly beneath the hallway's subtle air currents. Malik looked at it, not as a challenge, but as a mirror. In those printed symbols, in that mathematical language of limits and infinities, he saw something most of them couldn't. He saw freedom. He saw revenge. He saw proof. Years of stolen moments returned to him. Late nights reading library cast-offs his mom brought home from donation bins, solving problems on the backs of grocery receipts, watching MIT lectures on a cracked phone with stolen Wi-Fi. This wasn't new to him. The only difference was that now, Someone had dared him to show it. He moved toward the book, slowly, as if pulled by something inevitable. His hands were still calloused from moving mop handles and lifting buckets, but they trembled now not from fatigue, from focus. He reached down and picked it up, studying the problem Carrington had mocked him over. A double integral, partial derivatives nested inside. Complex, yes, but not impossible. He didn't need to prove anything to that man. But something deeper inside. The boy who had sat in silence for too long, the son who had watched his mother swallow dignity for a paycheck, whispered otherwise. This wasn't just about solving a problem. This was about reshaping how they saw him. Not a cleaner's kid, not a statistic, but something else entirely. A storm misunderstood and underestimated, waiting to break open. Malik closed the book gently, but his grip was iron. His face, usually guarded, now held something unspoken. The calm just before thunder cracks. The insult had landed, but it hadn't shattered him. It had sparked something much more dangerous. And as he turned away, walking silently back toward the janitor's supply closet, his eyes lingered for a moment on the bulletin board ahead, an announcement for an open-air math recitation scheduled for next week. Carrington would be there. So would students. And a whiteboard. His mother's voice echoed faintly in his memory. They can't erase you if you show up in ink. Malik's fingers clenched. He didn't need an invitation. He had the problem. And he had the answer. As the morning bell echoed faintly in the distance, Malik looked down at the calculus book one last time, and then up at the glowing overhead lights, eyes burning with a quiet fury. This time, they would see him, and they would never forget. The calculus book still felt warm in Malik's hands, as he slipped it into the supply room, hiding it beneath a stack of folded towels before anyone noticed. His mother's shift was ending, and the building had begun to fill with the steady pulse of students drifting toward their morning classes. But Malik wasn't listening to their chatter or footsteps. His mind had begun to move at a pace far quicker than his body could match, replaying the professor's voice, not as a wound now but as fuel. The polished hallways he once trudged through with bowed shoulders suddenly felt like corridors in which something had been awakened, something sharp, relentless, and impossible to silence. Every insult Carrington had whispered earlier replayed in his mind, but with each recollection the sting lessened and shifted into something colder, more focused. He wasn't thinking of the embarrassment. He was thinking of integrals. He was thinking of limit. He was thinking of the board he had seen across the courtyard where students gathered to trade ideas, as if brilliance belonged only to those with card access and crisp button-down shirts. Malik had walked past that board 1,000 times. Never once had he touched the markers resting beneath it. But now everything inside him pulsed with the urge to step forward. As he began sweeping the empty study lounge, something in him drifted backward, toward the nights long before this morning, where discovery had not happened under insult, but under the hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet rhythm of mops drying along the wall. He remembered evenings in which classrooms emptied out, and his mother's soft humming filled the air, creating a cocoon of calm around them. While she sprayed disinfectant and wiped down whiteboards, Malik would steal glances at the equations left scribbled behind by distracted undergraduates. Sometimes he stared at them long enough to commit them to memory, before erasing them. Other times, when his mother wasn't watching, he would rewrite them in the margins of discarded worksheets he found in recycling bins. He never solved them for validation. He solved them because the numbers felt like doors, each step a new room, each room offering a new way out of the life that had boxed him in. There had been a semester when a kind-hearted TA left behind entire stacks of practice packets outside the lecture hall. No one ever claimed the ones at the bottom, bent or smudged with coffee stains. Malik had slipped them under his hoodie like contraband, and studied them at home long after midnight while his mother slept. He would sit by the cracked window of their apartment, listening to the distant sirens and late-night arguments drifting from the street below, while he reworked integral bounds until they made perfect sense. Every page he filled acted as a shield against the world outside, a world that insisted kids like him stayed predictable. Poverty tried to narrow him, society tried to define him. Even teachers at his public high school saw him through a lens that dimmed his potential. But the equations never judged him. They just waited for him to understand them on his own terms. By the time he was 16, Malik had turned an old janitor's logbook into a silent testament of his mind. The book had once been used for recording supply shortages and maintenance complaints, but the moment Malik found it abandoned in a closet, he saw possibility instead of paperwork. Its empty pages became his sanctuary. He filled it with dense calculations, careful graphing sketches, experiments with abstract functions, and solutions far beyond what his school curriculum ever covered. The ink always pressed deep into the paper because he wrote with the urgency of someone who feared time might run out before anyone realized what he was capable of. The pages told a story no adult ever asked to hear. While his classmates scrolled through social media or argued over cafeteria drama, Malik built mathematical landscapes in secret, landscapes that made him feel infinite despite living in a world intent on limiting him. But it wasn't just intellect driving him. It was his mother. Angela Simmons returned home, every night with aching wrists and feet swollen from hours of scrubbing tiles that would never know her name. Yet she carried herself with a gentleness that baffled Malik. Even exhaustion couldn't snuff out the warmth in her smile. She bore the weight of 2 jobs, grief over a husband gone too soon, and constant financial uncertainty. Yet she moved as though she believed a better world still waited somewhere for him. That quiet hope was an unspoken plea. Rise higher than this. For her sake, Malik pushed harder, studied longer, and dreamed in ways he would never dare admit aloud. Every formula he conquered felt like another step toward giving her the life she deserved, even though she never asked for repayment. That morning, after Carrington's insult, the memory of her weary smile had hit him harder than the mockery itself. He could accept being dismissed. He could accept being overlooked. But he could not accept the idea that anyone believed the son of a janitor had no right to brilliance. He swept the floor with slow, deliberate strokes, replaying the moment Carrington smirked at the sight of his shoes. The hurt rose again, but beneath it lay the defiant certainty that his genius was real, even if no one else had witnessed it yet. As the minutes dragged on, Malik drifted toward the closet where he kept the logbook, unable to resist the pull of what it represented. He retrieved it from beneath a stack of old supply request forms, brushing away dust that had settled along its spine. The cover had softened over the years from constant handling, but inside the pages remained crisp, etched with evidence of nights spent learning beyond the world's expectations. Today, however, the book felt heavier, as if aware of the shift that had occurred within him. He opened to a page near the center, one filled with a dense proof he had completed months earlier. A sequence of steps so intricate it had taken him 3 nights to perfect. The lines flowed with careful precision, demonstrating a level of understanding no one expected from a teenager without tutors, without classes, without privilege. Each symbol showcased not only knowledge, but hunger. Malik studied the page, tracing the ink with his thumb, and an emotion stirred within him, not pride, but something sharper, more dangerous. This book held the truth the world refused to see. He had stayed silent out of fear of drawing attention, but that silence had cost him dignity this morning. It had allowed a professor to treat him like a joke. For the first time, Malik wondered if hiding his mind had been the real mistake. He turned to the final page, which he had left blank, intentionally, saving it for a moment when he felt ready to step beyond secrecy. Today, the moment had arrived. He pulled a pen from his pocket and began writing, not a proof, not an equation, but his name in deliberate, steady strokes. The ink soaked into the fiber as though claiming the space, declaring itself without hesitation. Malik Simmons, a signature not meant for homework or permission slips, but for a future that demanded courage. He stared at the name, breath steady, resolve building. This page felt like a threshold, and crossing it meant no turning back. The boy who hid brilliance behind mops was being replaced by someone else. Someone ready to confront the world that had always underestimated him. Malik folded the page slowly, sealing his signature within the notebook, and as the paper creased beneath his fingers, a thought surfaced with chilling clarity. The next person who doubted him would not be met with silence, because he now held proof powerful enough to upend everything. William Carrington didn't simply belong to Harvard. He embodied it. Every thread of his wardrobe, every syllable of his lecture, every pause before delivering a sarcastic remark felt meticulously designed to remind the world that he was carved from privilege and preserved by institutional loyalty. His shoes clicked with a calculated rhythm down the corridors, announcing his arrival before his voice ever did. He never needed to demand attention. Attention followed him like an obedient shadow. Even the chandeliers above the lecture hall seemed to shine more favorably when he stood beneath them. His office bore the scent of aged leather, imported coffee, and unchallenged authority. Diplomas framed in gold leaf wallpapered the space behind his chair, while shelves bowed under the weight of hardcovers that bore his name on their spines. His classroom was not just a place for learning, it was his stage, his echo chamber, his empire. Students didn't dare yawn while he spoke. Not because he inspired awe, but because they knew one wrong glance would turn them into a punchline. His sarcasm was legend, and his dismissals came with a razor's edge. No one questioned him, not even other faculty members, because challenging Currington meant gambling your academic worth against the weight of generational clout. Yet behind the charisma and credentials was something far uglier than intellectual superiority. Currington was not merely proud. He was insulated. He hadn't just inherited money, he had inherited certainty. Certainty that the system would always favor his kind. Certainty that brilliance belonged in bodies that looked like his. Certainty that boys like Malik Simmons were useful only as metaphors or maintenance. To him, diversity was a brochure cover, not a lived truth. Merit, he believed, naturally gravitated toward legacy, not labor. Malik's presence on campus had irritated him long before their encounter. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of annoyance when he'd spot the boy pushing his mother's cart across the mathematics wing. The problem wasn't that Malik was there. The problem was that he walked. Malik's eyes didn't carry the blank stare of someone resigned to a future of manual work. They carried curiosity, and that to Currington was a form of insubordination. There was a rule here, though no one spoke it aloud. Labor should pass through corridors, not pause to understand them. Currington remembered the first time he saw Malik peeking at the corner of a chalkboard during an open recitation. He'd been explaining non-elementary integrals to a group of freshmen. While most students nodded performatively, Malik stood at the edge of the room, holding a mop but staring directly at the problem. Eyes narrowed, not in confusion but in focus. Currington had noticed, and something shifted in him that day, something small and petty. It wasn't just about the calculus, it was about who dared to look. From then on, he began choosing Malik as a convenient outlet for his elitist jabs, small barbs dropped in passing, always ambiguous enough to escape formal complaints, but sharp enough to wound. In the ivory tower Currington ruled, Malik was a useful reminder that not everyone belonged, and when that moment in the hallway arrived, when Malik stood silently beside the calculus book, Currington had struck without hesitation, because he knew the audience would nod along, even if silently. The cruelty wasn't a misstep, it was tradition. But what Currington didn't expect, what unsettled him even if he wouldn't admit it, was the boy's silence. It wasn't the silence of submission. It was something else, calculated, controlled. Currington had humiliated dozens over the years. Underprepared students, nervous TA applicants, junior colleagues trying to challenge his claims, but none of them looked back at him with the same unreadable calm that Malik had, and it bothered him. That morning, a few days after the insult in the hallway, Currington stood by the glass-paneled entrance of the east courtyard. His fingers tapped absent-mindedly on the edge of his coffee cup, as he watched students gather around the bulletin board where he often posted public math challenges, problems too difficult for most, designed to separate the brilliant from the merely competent. Today there was buzz. He could hear it in the way voices swelled and hushed. Whispers about the janitor kid had begun to circulate. Strange, premature rumors that someone had actually solved one of his signature problems, and quickly, he dismissed them. Of course. Students gossiped, especially during exam week, but still, the whispers itched at his composure. As he walked past the board on his way to the upper hall, his eyes briefly scanned the name signed beneath yesterday's posted equation. That's when he saw it. At the bottom, in careful block print, Malik Simmons. The chalk signature was unmistakably fresh, just a few hours old. Currington froze for a fraction of a second. He told himself it was a joke, a prank, but part of him couldn't stop the question from bubbling up. What if? Still, pride would not allow him to linger. He carried on, but the signature followed him like an echo. Back in his lecture hall, Currington's routine unfolded with precision. The same opening remarks, the same rhetorical questions, the same subtle contempt for students who fumbled their formulas. But something was off. His timing faltered. He caught himself rechecking a proof he'd delivered hundreds of times before. The room felt different, tighter. A few students in the front row whispered behind their laptops, their eyes flicking toward him, then back to the door. When the lecture ended, Currington remained seated longer than usual. The room emptied, but his gaze lingered on the chalkboard. For the first time in years, he wondered if someone outside his curated world had cracked through the varnish of his control, and not just anyone. Someone who wasn't supposed to be here. Later that afternoon, as Currington walked across the quad, he spotted Malik again. He was dressed the same as always. Hoodie slightly too small, sneakers scuffed, hands tucked into the sleeves of a janitor's jacket. But Carrington noticed something new. A calmness in Malik's stride, a quiet defiance. He wasn't sneaking glances at equations anymore. He was moving through the campus like someone who had answered a question the rest of them hadn't yet asked. Carrington's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't friendly. It was a quiet calculation, the kind he used before sharpening his blade. He'd underestimated the boy once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. The game had changed, and Carrington wasn't about to surrender his throne to someone who didn't even have a student ID. As Malik passed him, unaware of the professor's narrowed eyes, Carrington's gaze fell once more to the boy's sneakers, the same worn-out soles that had once made him a joke. But now, to Carrington, they looked like something far more dangerous, a symbol not of poverty, but of defiance. And with a smirk laced in malice, Carrington whispered under his breath, "Let's see how far your dirty shoes can take you." Harvard's East Courtyard basked in filtered sunlight, its stone benches and sweeping steps forming a semicircle around the center stage. An old rolling whiteboard, flanked by potted shrubs and the faint scent of espresso from a nearby campus cafe. On certain days, professors hosted impromptu outdoor recitations here. A tradition meant to democratize knowledge, though in reality, it functioned as an elite performance. These sessions weren't just about theory, they were about presence, about command, about hierarchy cloaked as intellectual exchange. And no one wielded that performance better than Dr. William Carrington. Students gathered early that morning, notebooks in hand, laptops open on crossed knees, coffee cups tucked between thighs. They had come to see a show, and Carrington never disappointed. He arrived wearing a tweed overcoat draped, like royalty, coffee in hand, and eyes already scanning the audience for weakness. His assistant wheeled the whiteboard into place with ceremonial precision. Then Carrington picked up a marker and turned, drawing the first problem with deliberate slowness. Each stroke of ink crackled with arrogance. The equation he scribbled wasn't from a textbook. It was a hybrid of concepts, nested integrals interlaced with variable transformations, and an improper boundary limit. It was the kind of problem designed to fail anyone not intimately familiar with higher-order calculus, not meant to teach, but to expose. Carrington finished the last symbol and stepped back, turning to his audience with a smirk. Eyes locked, tone crisp, he projected his voice like a performer mid-monologue. "Let's put some minds to work this morning," he announced. "Anyone brave enough to take a stab? Think of it as a rite of passage." The students chuckled nervously, exchanging glances, unsure if the question was rhetorical. A few brave ones leaned in, but none moved. They'd seen what happened when someone got an answer wrong in Carrington's sessions. The professor didn't critique. He dissected. He mocked. Being wrong in front of him meant becoming the example, the warning to others. And then his gaze shifted, calculated, predatory, to the edge of the courtyard, where Malik stood with his mother's cleaning bucket beside him. He hadn't meant to be there long. He was just passing through after dropping off some supplies in the adjacent academic wing. But as soon as Carrington's voice hit the air, Malik had paused, drawn in by the whiteboard and the growing crowd. His eyes scanned the equation, his brain sparked with recognition. And before he could turn away, Carrington called him out. "You there," Carrington said, gesturing with the marker toward Malik. "Don't be shy. I assume you've seen a mop and bucket, but have you seen an integral like this before?" A ripple of laughter moved through the students, unsure, hesitant. Some grinned, others looked away. Malik froze. His first instinct was to disappear, to blend into the background again like always. But Carrington wasn't done. "Tell you what," he continued, smiling as if this were some light-hearted icebreaker. "Why don't you give this one a try? Let's democratize knowledge, shall we?" It wasn't an invitation. It was a trap. The same smug trap Carrington had used on nervous students for years. Only this time, the bait was Malik's skin, his shoes, his silence. This wasn't about math. This was about control, public control. A lesson, not in calculus, but in place. Malik felt the temperature shift. Not in the air, but in the gaze of every student watching. His chest tightened. Some looked amused. Others seemed uncomfortable, but none of them moved. No one objected. No one questioned the cruelty hiding in plain sight. They just waited, curious to see if the janitor's kid would crack under the spotlight. He looked at the board. The symbols weren't foreign to him. In fact, they formed a shape he recognized. An old problem he had toyed with months ago, modified slightly, but familiar enough. Malik's fingers curled into fists at his side. He knew this wasn't about proving knowledge. Carrington didn't expect a correct answer. He expected humiliation. But Malik wasn't the same boy from last week. He stepped forward. Gasps fluttered through the crowd like scattered leaves. Carrington's smile twitched, a flicker of surprise betraying his confidence. Malik reached for the piece of chalk that had been resting on the ledge of the whiteboard. For a second the world felt impossibly still, like the universe had pulled all its breath into one tight space, just behind his ribs. As he stepped up to the board, he caught sight of his reflection in the shiny white surface. Hoodie faded, sneakers worn, face steady. His heart pounded, but his hand didn't tremble. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't speak, he just stared at the problem, letting his brain arrange the parts like gears clicking into place. Then, unexpectedly, a voice from the crowd broke the silence, not mocking, but questioning. "Wait, isn't he?" It was a girl's voice. Sharp, uncertain. A freshman, maybe. Her whisper cut through the stillness. Another student leaned in. "That's the janitor's son, right?" Carrington's face shifted, ever so slightly. He hadn't expected murmurs of recognition. He had meant to trap a stranger, not someone whose silent presence had already begun unsettling the unspoken rules. But Malik didn't react. He tuned out the whispers. He tuned out Carrington. He focused on the chalk on the edges of the integral sign, on the nested limits he had seen before, and suddenly the noise faded. He moved the chalk to the board. The first line appeared beneath the equation, deliberate, bold, exact. As he drew it, the courtyard fell into eerie silence. Even Carrington didn't speak. Dozens of students leaned forward, breath held, eyes wide. Because at that moment, for the first time, it didn't look like Malik had come to answer a question. It looked like he had come to end one. The first sound that cracked the silence wasn't a voice. It was the soft, deliberate scratch of chalk against the board. Malik's hand moved with instinct, not hesitation. The arc of the chalk was clean, practiced, familiar. He wrote like someone who had lived inside this language, not studied it from afar. His movements weren't tentative or rehearsed. They were rhythmic, like a pianist returning to a piece long memorized. And though the courtyard was still full, it felt as though only two people existed in that moment, Malik and the equation. A few students leaned forward unconsciously, eyes narrowing. The expression on their faces shifted slowly from amusement to curiosity, then disbelief. The steps Malik was taking weren't vague guesses. He wasn't fumbling with rules or second-guessing syntax. He was simplifying inner expressions with precision, isolating variables, shifting boundaries with an ease that suggested not only comprehension but creativity. He didn't just understand the problem, he was bending it to his will. Carrington stood just a few feet away, arms crossed, brow furrowing. He tried to conceal the twitch in his cheek, the way his fingers clenched around the marker in his hand. The boy wasn't supposed to engage with the problem, let alone solve it. This had been designed to embarrass, to prove a point, to reinforce the unspoken hierarchy of intellect and identity. But now, as Malik filled line after line with airtight logic, Carrington's certainty began to unravel. Malik advanced swiftly through the outer integrals, simplifying terms, executing substitutions, reducing a labyrinth of complexity into a narrow corridor of solvable beauty. The final transformation, an elegant shift using a boundary trick only the top students ever grasped, was the kind of step most people missed entirely. But Malik didn't miss it. He carved it cleanly into the board, a quiet signature of competence that forced a stunned hush to tighten across the crowd. One student, a junior math major, known for challenging TAs in lecture, let out an involuntary, "Oh my God." Another leaned over to their friend and whispered, "He's actually right." The murmurs began as static but grew rapidly into something heavier. Eyes darted between Malik's hand and Carrington's face, where the cracks in composure had begun to show. No longer a smirk, no longer aloof confidence, just a twitch of the lip, a vein pulsing at the temple. Still, Malik didn't pause. He wrote until the final solution emerged. Simplified, boxed, complete. There was nothing extravagant about it. No dramatic flourish, just the raw final answer beneath a line of logic that could pass any doctoral defense. The chalk stopped. His hand lowered. He stepped back. And that was when the silence deepened into something electric. For a moment, no one moved. The air seemed to hold its breath, as if the buildings themselves were stunned into stillness. Even Carrington didn't speak. The professor, known for filling every pause with cutting commentary, stood frozen, eyes fixed on the board. His mind scrambled for some invisible flaw, some crack in the argument, some lifeline that could explain away the truth now etched in front of them. But there was nothing. Then came the flick of a phone camera. A sophomore in the back raised their phone, thumb tapping the record button. Another followed. Then another. Within seconds, the courtyard was a web of lenses, capturing what had just happened. A janitor's son, solving a problem faster and cleaner than anyone expected, even the man who had written it. Malik didn't look at the cameras. He didn't smile or bow or speak. He simply stepped away from the board, slow and deliberate, eyes never leaving the floor, as if what he'd done wasn't miraculous, but necessary, like it had always been waiting to happen, and today just happened to be the day the world caught up. Carrington's jaw tightened. His face, once composed and polished, flushed with a creeping red that started at his neck and ballooned up his cheeks. The heat of humiliation hit harder, because it wasn't loud. No one had shouted. No one had cheered. There was only silence, calculation, and truth. Malik hadn't embarrassed him with attitude or bravado. He had done it with accuracy, with facts. For a man like Carrington, there was no worse defeat. A student dared to speak. "That was beautiful," she said, voice barely audible, but enough to stir another wave of murmurs. Carrington blinked, finally breaking from his stupor. He forced a smile, strained and hollow, and stepped forward, as if reclaiming his stage. But the performance was over. The crowd had already seen the real headliner. "That's enough," he said curtly, voice sharper than intended. "Let's not mistake performance for understanding." But it was too late. The recording was already circling the group chat. Someone posted it to the university's Reddit forum. Another tagged the math department's official account. In less than 5 minutes, Malik Simmons, whose name had never appeared on a syllabus, whose face no professor had ever called on, had become the center of a conversation Harvard hadn't prepared for. Carrington turned toward Malik, ready to assert control again, but something caught his eye. Not the boy's clothes, not the chalk-stained fingers, but the quiet in his face. Malik wasn't triumphant. He wasn't smug. He was focused, centered, as if solving the equation hadn't been for the crowd or the cameras, but for something far more personal. And that, more than anything, unsettled Carrington. The professor opened his mouth to speak, to dismiss, to twist the narrative back in his favor. But before he could utter a word, a voice from the crowd cut through the courtyard. "Why isn't he a student here?" It was a simple question, but its implications hung in the air, like thunder. Carrington flinched, only slightly, but enough. Another student added, louder this time, "If this had come from one of us, you'd be handing out recommendation letters." The tide had shifted. Malik still hadn't said a word. He stepped back from the board fully now, hands at his sides, chest rising and falling. And as the whispers surged around him, as phones recorded every blink of Carrington's flustered silence, Malik turned to leave. Not hurried, not boastful, just walking away. But just before he crossed the edge of the courtyard, a faculty member Malik had never seen before, older, quiet, watching from the building's second-story balcony, stepped away from the glass window and disappeared into the shadows, phone still in hand. And far from the courtyard, in the administrative building across campus, the dean's assistant opened her inbox to find an email with the subject line, "You're going to want to see this." By the time Malik returned to the janitor's supply room, his hands were still stained with chalk, but his mind buzzed with a silence louder than applause. He hadn't spoken a word after the solution, hadn't responded to the murmurs or the shifting gazes, but the weight of what had just happened clung to him like static. He placed the cleaning bucket down beside the sink, rinsed his hands and stared at his reflection in the tiny cracked mirror above the soap dispenser. There was no pride in his eyes, no smile, just stillness, like someone standing at the edge of something irreversible. Elsewhere, the courtyard had become an ecosystem of whispers. Students left the whiteboard without wiping it down, as if it were a crime scene. Phones buzzed, group chats lit up, Instagram stories blinked to life. Short, blurry clips of Malik solving the impossible. Some captured Carrington's rigid expression, others zoomed in on the final answer, scrawled in neat block letters. Within minutes, it was no longer just a video. It was a phenomenon, and the title forming around it wasn't Math Challenge. It was Janitor's Son Destroys Harvard Professor Live. The first wave of responses was awe. Dozens of comments under the shared video marveled at the rawness of Malik's brilliance. "Bro solved that like it was a grocery list." "That professor looked shook. He wrote faster than my tuition payments." But admiration alone was never enough to protect someone like Malik, because not everyone was impressed. Some couldn't believe what they'd seen. Others refused. Skeptics crept in through the comment sections like mold, questioning the validity, questioning whether Malik had somehow seen the problem beforehand, even implying that it was staged for attention. Let's be real. That was edited. There's no way some janitor kid solves that in one go. He probably memorized it from a solution bank. The ugliness didn't take long to surface, and it wasn't just online. By mid-afternoon, the math department was in damage control. Emails circulated discreetly among faculty. Carrington hadn't addressed the situation publicly, but his silence only amplified the noise. Graduate TAs exchanged glances during coffee breaks. Professors whispered behind closed doors. A student overheard one admin muttering, "This is going to cost someone their credibility," though no one dared say who. For those close to Carrington, the day had begun with routine respect, but now, unease rippled under the surface. The professor who once carried unshakable authority had shown something terrifying to the Harvard elite: vulnerability, and that vulnerability had come at the hands of a boy whose very presence should have remained unnoticed. By early evening, the video had left Harvard's digital walls. On Twitter, the clip exploded. A prominent STEM influencer reposted it with the caption, "This is why merit isn't always found in resumes." Within hours, it had racked up over 400,000 views. A black academic from Stanford added, "This young man reminds us that genius doesn't ask for permission. The institution owes him something now." But others fired back with cold fury masked as logic. This kind of stunt undermines real scholars. Affirmative action gone rogue. Great performance, but what's his SAT score? Some critics weren't subtle. One anonymous post read, "This is why janitors should stay in their lane." Malik didn't see most of this immediately. After finishing his shift, he went home with his mother, who knew only that something had happened on campus. She asked him if he was okay. He nodded. She didn't press. He didn't explain. They ate in silence. The weight of his mother's tired eyes made him more afraid than the storm brewing outside. But late that night, when she finally fell asleep on the couch, still in her work uniform, Malik sat in the dim light of their cramped apartment and opened his phone. His notifications had mutated into something unrecognizable. Over 200 friend requests, messages from classmates he barely remembered, emails titled interview request, and let's talk scholarships. But scattered among the praise were messages that burned. "You embarrassed the wrong man. Do you even go here? Enjoy the 15 minutes. You just killed your mom's job." Malik scrolled slower now. His breathing deepened. The room felt smaller. The edges of the screen blurred slightly in his vision. Then, near the bottom of the inbox, a message appeared. No name, just a line of text. "You ruined everything." No context, no signature. But the words hit him with eerie precision, because Malik knew deep in the hollow of his chest that this wasn't coming from a stranger. This was personal. This was someone inside the walls of the institution he had just disrupted. And it meant the real backlash hadn't even begun. Malik set the phone down slowly, but before he could process the message further, the screen lit up again with a new notification. This time a voicemail, 1 minute long, from an unfamiliar Harvard extension number. And as he tapped play, the first word from the caller sent a cold rush through his veins. "Mr. Simmons, this is Dean Kessler's office. We need to speak with you immediately." The voicemail from the dean's office stayed trapped in Malik's mind long after the recording ended, its polite tone camouflaging the suspicion beneath every syllable. And as he walked onto campus the following morning, the air around Harvard felt different, as if the place had quietly decided to reject him. The courtyard where he had solved the infamous equation had been wiped clean of evidence. The whiteboard itself removed entirely, as if the moment had never happened. And while Malik stood in the early light trying to understand the sudden emptiness before him, Carrington was already orchestrating his retaliation, with the cold precision of a man who had never been challenged by someone outside his crafted world. 3 emails. That was all it took to weaponize the institution, one restricting evening access to academic buildings for non-enrolled individuals, another instructing library security to enforce ID checks more aggressively, and a third, more insidious, questioning whether the relatives of custodial staff were misusing STEM facilities. None of the emails mentioned Malik by name, yet every implication pointed directly at him, and by midweek he started feeling the quiet suffocation of these new rules. His evening badge denied him entry into Hawthorne Hall, forcing a security guard to escort him out with an apologetic but firm insistence that policy had changed. The library staff, who once smiled at him as he returned books after hours, now hesitated, asking him to speak to a supervisor before entering the math wing. And fellow janitors, men and women who had always offered him warm nods and soft laughter, now paused around him with tight lips and downcast eyes, as though they feared standing too close to someone who had accidentally become a threat to Harvard's unspoken hierarchy. Even his mother sensed the shift while they folded towels in the storage room, her gaze linger on him with worry as he brushed her concerns aside, trying to seem steady though inside him, something tender was beginning to brew. It all came to a quiet, suffocating peak on Thursday evening, when two campus officers approached him during his cleaning shift, not hostile, not aggressive, but disturbingly rehearsed, to inquire why he was on campus after restricted hours. And though he tried to explain that he had always worked these evenings, the officers simply asked for his badge, apologized as if reading from a script, and walked him out through the same gate where hours earlier students had spilled in laughing, planning their weekends free from the invisible chains tightening around him. Standing outside Harvard's iron gates at dusk, the campus glowing gold behind him, and the street humming with traffic, Malik felt a strange stillness settle over him, not defeat, not fear, but a dangerous clarity that he had become a problem they were trying very carefully to erase. He did not shout or pace, or break down. He simply stood there, breathing against the sting of humiliation, as the sky darkened and the campus lights brightened steadily, each one a reminder that every privilege inside those gates was being defended against someone like him. Just as he turned to leave, unsure whether his next step should be toward home, a lawyer, or simply silence, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out expecting another hateful notification, but instead saw a single message from an unknown number, 6 words that struck him with a mix of fear and possibility. I saw what they did. Meet me. The message on Malik's phone. I saw what they did. Meet me clung to his thoughts like static as he stood outside Harvard's iron gates, the evening chill sinking through the fabric of his hoodie, the city behind him wide and indifferent. He stared at those 6 words as if they were written in a different language, one not born in equations or classrooms, but in something older: solidarity. There was no name, no signature, and yet something told him it wasn't a threat, not like the others. This one felt careful, quiet, like someone had chosen their words not to scare, but to signal. Instead of heading home, Malik turned back toward the edge of campus, his steps slow and deliberate, slipping alongside paths that custodians used to avoid main traffic, the back routes he knew well. Lights buzzed softly overhead as he passed beneath maintenance tunnels, the kind of spaces where brilliance and invisibility often collide. Just past the East Quad's storage unit, near a dim side door labeled "Service Entrance Only," he spotted a figure, older, dressed in muted tones, standing beside a mop bucket, as if waiting for a ghost. It took him a moment to recognize her. Susan Patel, a tenured professor in applied mathematics, respected yet distant, known on campus for her brutal honesty and refusal to play departmental politics. She didn't offer a greeting. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she stepped forward and slipped a folded packet into his hands. Notes scribbled with blue ink, not just copied equations, but insights. Watch the upper limit here. Looks clean but hides a trick. Used to confuse me. Think substitution. If you see symmetry, stop and reframe. These weren't notes from a lecture. They were the footprints of someone who had once struggled with the same material, and who was now reaching back to guide someone forward. Before Malik could thank her, she simply whispered, "They think you're a threat because they were never taught to imagine you." And with that, she disappeared into the night like a ghost escaping through the crack. Stunned, Malik walked to the only place that still felt like neutral ground, the janitor's lounge behind Hawthorne Hall, the room usually filled with the low whir of vending machines, and the clatter of tired men sipping burnt coffee, felt tense tonight. Whispers hushed as he entered, but no one turned away, no one asked him to leave. Instead, a young man rose from the couch near the corner. Malik recognized him from the math building. Elijah, a grad student with heavy eyes and sleeves always pushed to the elbow. Elijah looked around, then quickly crossed the room and handed Malik a sealed envelope. "I'm in Carrington's department," he said in a hushed voice, eyes darting toward the hallway. "I saw the internal memo. They're escalating this. You're not being paranoid, they're trying to isolate you. I'm not supposed to be talking to you." Malik didn't know what to say, but Elijah didn't wait for a response. "Some of us have been waiting for someone like you to walk in and tear the curtain down." He turned to leave, then paused. "There's a study circle. Private. Unlisted. No professors. No approvals. It's not just math anymore, it's a conversation we should have had years ago." He vanished into the stairwell, footsteps fading like the last echoes of safety. Malik stared at the envelope. Inside wasn't just a stack of notes, it was a single folded sheet with 6 bold, handwritten words. "We believe you. Meet us at 8 p.m. tonight." No name, no address, just a message, and yet it felt heavier than any academic recognition, more real than any apology. It was proof he wasn't invisible anymore. Around him, the lounge had shifted. The same custodians who'd watched him grow up in these halls now gave him subtle nods. Not pity, not sympathy, but something firmer, understand. One of them, a middle-aged man with silver streaks in his hair, handed Malik a wrapped sandwich from the vending machine. "For later," he said. "You'll need the fuel." No other words were exchanged, but Malik understood. These were people who had seen the machinery of erasure grind for decades, who had lived through false promises, quiet demotions, and the endless rewriting of rules designed to exclude. They saw now that Malik had cracked something bigger than calculus. He'd cracked the illusion that power was always earned. He'd reminded them that sometimes, simply being excellent while black, while poor, while present was enough to get you removed. As the hour ticked closer to 8, Malik's pulse quickened. He didn't know who he would meet, or what would be said. All he knew was that someone had made a space, quiet, hidden, outside the institution's gaze, for truth to breathe. He stood up to leave, grabbing his jacket, when a janitor he barely knew approached, and handed him a small metal keyring. No eye contact, no explanation, just a quiet gesture. Malik looked down, and saw a faded label on the tag, Lecture Hall B, After Hours Access. And just like that, the message was clear. Someone, maybe multiple people, had already begun opening doors for him. As Malik stepped out into the cold night, the keys clinking softly in his palm, his phone buzzed once more, this time with a location pin dropped anonymously, landing exactly in the center of the underground archives beneath the math department, a place locked to students after dusk. And beneath it, one final message appeared. "Bring the notebook. You're not just solving for yourself anymore." Malik had never been a headline. He had never been a trending topic, a hashtag, or a story meant to be retweeted by strangers who didn't know his name 12 hours earlier. But as he followed the GPS coordinates toward the hidden archive that night, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications rolled in like waves. More than 1,000, then 2,000, the number rising so fast, it blurred. It had started the moment someone reposted the video of him solving Carrington's challenge to a national Black STEM page, with over 500,000 followers. The caption read simply, "Harvard professor tries to clown janitor's son, gets schooled." The story exploded within the hour. TikTok clips stitched with commentary, Instagram reels using his image against slow piano music, threads unpacking the racial implications, and Twitter, where everything burns hotter, began calling it the Harvard humiliation. But with fame came fire. By 2 a.m. his face was plastered across academic forums and gossip blogs alike. Some called him a prodigy, a hero, a walking argument against legacy admissions. Others dismissed the moment as staged, suspiciously cinematic. A few accused him of cheating, of memorizing the problem in advance, of being fed the answer by disgruntled faculty. "No way a janitor's kid solves that live," one viral tweet scoffed, attached to a thread of conspiracy-laced evidence that his chalk speed looked rehearsed. The comments grew darker, the deeper he scrolled. Photos of his mother in her uniform surfaced, not official portraits, but blurry shots someone had taken on campus without permission. His family was being watched. The narrative had left the confines of admiration and entered the realm of obsession, where praise and hatred danced side by side and neither offered safety. The internet didn't want Malik, it wanted a symbol. Some saw him as a threat to academic elitism, others as an opportunity to signal virtue. Activist pages posted his face with quotes he'd never said. Political pundits began framing his story as either proof of the American dream, or an attack on institutional merit. He wasn't a person anymore, he was a litmus test, and no one cared if he had ever asked for that role. His classmates were split. Some sent supportive DMs, words of awe and encouragement, including those who had never spoken to him before. "You're inspiring. They can't erase you now. We're watching history." But buried between those messages were others. Colder, sharper, anonymous. One read, "Hope you're proud. You made this about race. Congrats on dividing the campus." Another, "You embarrassed a man who could ruin your life." That was a mistake. Malik stopped reading after the fifth one. He felt the support and suspicion folding around him like opposing winds. pushing him nowhere but inward. By the time he reached the underground archives that night, Malik had grown quiet, not from fear but from exhaustion. His fingers were still gripping the ring of keys he'd been given. The lock clicked open, echoing in the dim corridor like a secret being spoken aloud for the first time. Inside, the space was silent. Rows of aging journals, mathematical relics, chalkboards from decades past. It felt like a sanctuary no one had touched in years. And yet, on the table in the center was a single candle, and beside it, 3 students, 2 faculty members, and Elijah, the grad student from earlier, already seated, notebooks open. They didn't greet him with applause or amazement. They greeted him with space. A seat was left open, materials laid out. One professor slid over a notebook and said only, "This is off record. This is safe." And for the next 3 hours, they didn't talk about Carrington. They talked about proof structure, mathematical gatekeeping, and the centuries of talent buried beneath institutional bias. Malik, for the first time, was not asked to perform. He was asked to contribute. He left that room changed, not because he had taught them something, but because they had allowed him to be what he always was, a peer. But peace is rarely allowed to linger for those who challenge power. By 5:30 a.m., Malik finally returned home. His mother was asleep, her back curled on the couch, TV still playing some late-night sitcom rerun. He pulled the blanket over her carefully, his limbs heavy, head pounding from a night that had bent the trajectory of his life. He placed his notebook, the one with his original integrals, solutions and scribbled insights, on the desk by the window. It had become more than notes now. It was proof of his past, and the threat it posed to those invested in keeping people like him small. As the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, Malik sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing himself to exhale. But just as the quiet settled, his phone lit up again, not with likes, not with shares, but with a direct message, anonymous. No profile picture. He clicked it out of habit, expecting another predictable insult. But this one was different. 6 words. Plain. Cold. "We know where your mother works." The breath caught in his throat. His chest tightened. This wasn't noise. This wasn't internet trolling or campus drama. This was targeted, personal, dangerous. He stared at the message, reading it again and again, as if somehow it would change. But it didn't. It stayed on the screen like a shadow refusing to move. Malik looked toward the living room where his mother slept peacefully, unaware that her son's fight had just turned into something much darker, and that now the price of brilliance wasn't just isolation or erasure. It was threat. By sunrise, Malik's world had shifted from viral admiration to visceral threat. The message, "We know where your mother works," had cracked something inside him that even Carrington's cruelty hadn't. It wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't a battle of minds now. It had become a warning cloaked in violence, aimed at the person he loved most. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat through dawn, watching the sun bleed through the blinds, his fingers frozen on the edges of his notebook, eyes flicking between his mother's silhouette and the screen, rereading those 6 words over and over, trying to decode the malice behind them. He didn't tell her, not yet. What could he say? That his intellect had become so visible, so threatening, that it had made her a target. On campus, the atmosphere had curdled. At first, students had chalked messages across stairwells. "Genius has no uniform. Proof doesn't discriminate. And math belongs to everyone." Someone taped up flyers with Malik's name beneath the word prodigy, listing links to education reform groups, quoting black mathematicians, and calling for Harvard to offer him a scholarship on merit alone. But as quickly as support had bloomed, resistance began clawing its way out of the shadows. Overnight, the stairwell messages were scrubbed away, flyers vanished, and in their place came whispers, accusations, sarcasm disguised as question. A group chat surfaced where students mocked his hero arc, accusing faculty of bending over backward for a janitor's son. One anonymous user wrote, "If he's so smart, why isn't he enrolled? If you don't earn your place, you don't get to change the rule." Another simply posted, "Keep it in the gutters." The phrase began appearing in darker places. On the wall of the east custodial closet, Malik found the words scrawled in red marker across the door, "Keep it in the gutters." He stared at it, expressionless, too numb to even be shocked. The other custodians avoided his eyes that day, not out of judgment, but out of fear, because they knew better than anyone that when institutions can't erase you through silence, they sharpen their edges. And when a black boy rises too far too fast, the world doesn't just whisper, it warns. His mother noticed the tension even before he spoke a word. The way he moved quieter now, how he avoided answering calls, how he jumped at the sound of the gate alarm. One night, as they packed cleaning supplies in the back of the janitor's truck, she finally turned to him and asked, "Are you in danger?" Her voice was low, not panicked, but heavy with the kind of dread only single mothers of black sons truly know. Malik didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he handed her a copy of the message. She read it, folded the paper once, and slid it into her pocket without speaking. But her hands trembled. That night she didn't go home. She stayed in the janitor's break room with him, the room tucked deep behind the loading docks, where no students went and no eyes watched. She laid down on the same plastic cot she used on overnight shifts when commuting back wasn't worth it. Malik took the bench by the supply closet. Neither of them slept well. He began staying there more often, not because he was homeless but because the comfort of their apartment now felt like a risk. And still, the pressure didn't stop. Professors had begun acting differently too. Some avoided looking at Malik altogether. Others, more dangerous, leaned into performance, offering smiles laced with passive-aggressive generosity. One lecturer even said aloud in a staff meeting, "Well, if our standards now include viral fame, I suppose the admissions committee has a new rubric." The room had laughed, the kind of laughter that only serves to cover up power preserving itself. Students were no different. A few still nodded in the hallways, but most looked through him. Whispers followed him down corridors like static electricity. Even his brilliance, undeniable and unrepeatable, had become ammunition. "He's just trying to go viral again," they said. Carrington didn't deserve to be ambushed like that. What's he even still doing here? The library, once his sanctuary, now felt radioactive. He stopped going. He stayed off social media. But the story didn't leave him alone. New articles popped up. The equation that shook Harvard, custodian's son, or campus symbol. When intelligence defies privilege, is the Ivy League ready? Every headline made his stomach twist tighter. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a story with no pause button, told through lenses that didn't know how to humanize him. And beneath it all, the messages kept coming, not all hateful. Some anonymous notes were quietly encouraging, but every time his phone buzzed, his body flinched, because the difference between praise and threat was now only one sentence apart. By the end of the week, Malik stopped going home altogether. He slept every night in the break room, resting his head on his backpack, his mother's worn sweater folded over him like a blanket. The cold from the cement floor seeped into his bones, but at least there, he felt invisible again. And for once, invisibility felt like safety. But the illusion cracked the next morning. The first thing he noticed was the sound, not the familiar buzz of vending machines, or the heater kicking in, but the wind, sharp and fast, seeping through the walls in a way it hadn't before. He sat up, dazed, and turned toward the small window above the break room door. It was shattered. Cracks spidered across the glass like fractures in ice, and beneath it lay a brick, jagged, heavy, unmistakably deliberate. Taped to it was a folded note. Malik stared at it for a full minute before picking it up. His fingers shook as he unfolded the paper. The words were written in blocky capital letters, as if whoever wrote it wanted to make sure it couldn't be ignored. "Stay silent." No name. No threats of violence. Just a command. Just an attempt to break what Carrington couldn't. His voice. Malik stood in the break room's silence, the cold from the broken window biting at his skin, the note trembling in his hand, and in that moment, he realized the game had changed again. This wasn't just backlash anymore, this was war by silence. And the next move had to be his. The shattered window still clung to Malik's skin when the email arrived. The next morning, its tone clinical, its phrasing too neutral to be innocent. "You are requested to appear before the Dean of Academic Affairs at 11:00 a.m. today. Failure to comply will be noted. No explanation, no accusation. Just a meeting." But Malik didn't need to guess. He knew exactly who was behind it. The timing was too perfect, too precise. The note through the window had been the warning. This was the enforcement. It was Carrington's world again, now dressed in administrative civility. Malik arrived early, hands clean, eyes hollow from another sleepless night spent pacing the janitor's room, wondering if it was cowardice or calculation that kept him from telling his mother about the threat. He wore the same hoodie, the same scuffed sneakers, but there was something new in his posture, something steady. The administrative wing of the university was hushed, carpeted in luxury, the air thicker than anywhere else on campus. Students didn't walk these halls. Only power did. Secretary desks lined the corridor like checkpoints, and Malik moved past them with silent resolve, his backpack slung over one shoulder like a soldier's gear. The dean's office loomed at the end of the hallway, its glass doors embossed with gold lettering, Office of Academic Integrity and Affairs. Inside, the walls were lined with portraits of past deans, their eyes painted with the kind of judgment that didn't need to speak. Behind the polished oak desk sat Dean Henry Kessler, gray-haired, bow-tied, a man whose smile was known for disarming lawsuits before they ever reached headlines. He stood when Malik entered, extending a hand as if this were a job interview, and not an ambush. "Malik Simmons," he said warmly. "Please, have a seat." But before Malik could respond, he heard the door click behind him. Dr. Carrington had entered. Dressed immaculately, Carrington carried a leather portfolio under his arm, and the same smug calm he always wore when he knew the odds were rigged in his favor. He didn't sit. He stood beside the dean's desk, hands clasped in front of him like a guest lecturer about to give a lesson on humility. Malik sat down, slow and deliberate. He said nothing. Dean Kessler cleared his throat. "We're here to address what's become a very public situation. As you can imagine, the video circulating has placed many members of this institution under unwanted scrutiny." Carrington nodded faintly, his eyes never leaving Malik. The dean continued, his tone measured. "Now, no one is accusing you of misconduct. However, there are concerns about academic clarity, about access, and about fairness." Malik tilted his head, his face blank. Carrington stepped forward. "What the dean means to say," he said smoothly, "is that while your performance in that courtyard was impressive, there are questions as to how a non-enrolled individual was able to so confidently solve a graduate-level equation without formal coursework." His smile thinned. "Some are wondering," he added, "if perhaps this is a case of memorization or guided coaching. After all, it would be easy to stage something like that, especially with certain faculty members sympathetic to alternative narratives." There it was, the accusation without evidence. The challenge cloaked in civility. Malik felt his pulse slow, not quicken. He had expected fire, expected denial, but Carrington had chosen something far more venomous, discrediting him through doubt. Dean Kessler leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. "Malik, if you're struggling academically, we can provide you with access to preparatory resources. There's no shame in needing help." Malik looked at them both. He wanted to laugh, not because anything was funny, but because the moment felt too absurd. He wasn't being celebrated. He was being diagnosed. His intelligence had become a condition they needed to explain away. He reached slowly for his backpack and unzipped it. Carrington's eyes narrowed. Malik didn't speak. He pulled out the notebook, the same one he had scribbled in for years, the same one he had kept hidden behind mop buckets and supply carts. It was thick with ink, edges frayed, corners bent. He opened it to the middle and laid it gently on the desk, turning it so it faced the dean. Line after line of complex work spilled across the page, proofs, integrals, theorems cross-referenced with footnotes, even sketches of abstract graphs. Not copied, not printed, handwritten, dated, sequence. "This," Malik said finally, voice even, "is how I've been cheating." Kessler's brow furrowed. Carrington shifted slightly, his grip on the leather folder tightening. Malik flipped to another section. "A months-old proof, annotated with multiple solution paths. I've solved every variation of that courtyard problem. Years ago, before anyone knew my name." He looked directly at Carrington now. "This notebook existed before your lecture series started, including those questions." The silence stretched. Kessler leaned forward, scanning the pages. His fingers brushed one corner, hesitating. "This is your work?" Malik didn't blink. Every line, every error, every correction. Carrington opened his mouth, then closed it. Malik leaned back. "You called me here to imply I had help, that I don't belong. But what you don't understand," he said, locking eyes with the professor, "is I've never needed permission to be brilliant. I only needed space." The room held its breath. Dean Kessler slowly closed the notebook, tapping its cover with 2 fingers. "We'll need to verify." "I scanned the entire thing," Malik interrupted. "It's time-stamped, cross-referenced with library Wi-Fi logs. Feel free." Carrington flinched, barely, but enough. Kessler sat back, exhaling. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. But something in his posture had shifted. For the first time in the meeting, he looked uncertain. But before anyone could respond, the office phone rang. Kessler answered, listened for a moment, then glanced at Malik with a strange look, part concern, part confusion. "You're going to want to hear this," he said, then held out the receiver toward Malik. "It's from the university's legal counsel. They say you're listed as the subject of a formal complaint from Dr. Currington." The receiver felt heavier than it should have. Malik stared at Dean Kessler's outstretched hand for a moment, unsure whether it was some elaborate trap or just another layer of institutional cruelty wrapped in protocol. But the dean's face gave nothing away, just a slight crease between his brows, like even he hadn't expected this. Malik took the call. On the other end, the voice was sharp, female and rehearsed, like someone who had already given the same speech several times that morning. "Mr. Simmons, this is Heather Crane, legal counsel for the university. We've received a formal complaint filed by Dr. William Currington, citing academic misconduct, unauthorized access to university materials, and disruption of institutional operations. You will be asked to present supporting documentation verifying the originality of your work." Malik didn't flinch. "I already did," he replied, eyes on Currington. "My notebook's on your dean's desk. My time-stamped scans are archived. The classroom footage proves it." There was a pause on the line, then the flat reply, "We'll be reviewing all material. Until then you are advised not to speak publicly about this case." He hung up before she could finish. For a moment, no one in the room moved. Then Dean Kessler picked up the notebook and opened it again. This time he turned the pages slower, lingering on the margins, the layered annotations, the subtle evolution of mathematical language. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't a copy. This was a creation, a progression, a lived archive of thought that could never be faked. Yet Currington didn't look at the notebook. He looked at the wall behind Kessler, as though the wood paneling might offer him a way out. But even that escape had begun to splinter. Later that afternoon, in a faculty conference room tucked behind the East Wing, a private review was convened. Not public, not yet, but the kind that decided whether the institution would protect itself or confront itself. 10 senior faculty members sat around the oval table, copies of Malik's scanned notebook open before them. Dr. Susan Patel sat at one end, her glasses perched low on her nose, flipping through the pages like a forensic expert. One of the applied math professors murmured. He didn't just solve the problems, he iterated them, explored alternates. "Look here." He ran 3 methods on one proof just to compare flow. Another leaned in. "These pages predate Carrington's challenge, month. Some of this even matches problems we haven't introduced yet." But not everyone nodded in admiration. Professor Dana Rem, Carrington's longtime colleague, a man who'd once co-authored a textbook with him, cleared his throat. "Even so, we have to be cautious about implications. This is Harvard. If we publicly acknowledge that a non-student solved and outperformed tenured faculty, the precedent..." Patel cut him off sharply. "What precedent? That we finally acknowledge brilliance when it's inconvenient to legacy." The tension tightened. Some looked away. Others sat in still, calculated silence. This wasn't about proof anymore. It was about loyalty, about how far the institution would bend to protect its pedigree, the kind of loyalty that whispered behind closed doors, that weighed justice against reputational damage. But then came the twist no one expected. Elijah, the graduate student, who had first invited Malik to the underground study circle, entered with a flash drive in hand. He was supposed to remain anonymous, in the background. But not today. He looked directly at the review board, voice steady, but tinged with quiet rage. "There's audio," he said, "from the courtyard session, from a campus security camera mounted on the west wall." Kessler looked up sharply. "You accessed internal security." Elijah didn't blink. "No. The footage was sent anonymously to me, probably from someone in IT. They're watching this too." He plugged in the drive. The audio played. Carrington's voice filled the room, clear, confident, dismissive. "Let's see if the mop kid can solve this." Gasps weren't dramatic, just low exhales, the kind of shock that didn't come from what was said, but from the fact that had been recorded. The rest of the clip played out. Malik's silence, the chalk scraping, the solution unfolding step by step in real time. It was undeniable. Immaculate, clean. And then came the final few seconds. Carrington's voice again, but this time stripped of its smooth veneer. He muttered, barely audible, "This is going to blow everything up." The silence afterward was profound. Carrington wasn't in the room. He had chosen not to attend the review. But his absence was beginning to speak louder than his presence ever had. Professor Ram finally looked up. His face was pale. Even if this is all true, if this goes public, it doesn't just affect him. It affects all of us. It undermines. Patel slammed the notebook shut. No. He didn't undermine this place. He exposed it. For a moment, no one replied. Then a voice at the far end of the table, one of the oldest professors in the department, rarely vocal, often seen as a neutral figure, leaned in, his voice quiet but clear, like a verdict. This changes everything. And just as the room sat in stunned stillness, the door creaked open again. Not a student, not faculty, but the university's legal counsel herself, Heather Crane, holding a manila folder. Her eyes scanned the room, then landed on Patel. "You're going to want to see this," she said. "We've doved something in Dr. Carrington's emails. It's not just about Malik. It's about manipulation of academic records going back 2 years." The folder lay heavy on the mahogany conference table, its contents unsettling the air like a slowly leaking poison. In the half-lit chamber behind barred windows and locked doors, senior faculty members sat clustered around, their polished faces now drained, eyes darting as though trying to outrun implication. Legal counsel Heather Crane's calm presence shattered silence. She had revealed a dossier of internal records, grade edits, suppressed recommendations, redacted memos, all tracing the quiet corruption seeded by years of favoritism and fear. As the pages unfolded one after another, the veneer of respectability slipped away. The evidence didn't just incriminate one man, it indicted an entire legacy. That legacy had built its foundation on lineage, on privilege, on silent exclusion. Now the foundation cracked. In the next few hours, the university scheduled an emergency assembly. It was meant to be private. Closed doors, controlled attendance, whispered resolutions. But news travels fast through corridors built on whispered guilt and trembling consciences. By midday, the quad outside the lecture hall erupted in movement. Students spilled out from dorms and cafeterias, clustering on stone steps and grassy lawns, holding handmade signs fluttering in the wind. "Genius has no uniform. Justice legacy. Proof doesn't discriminate." A hushed chant began to rise, growing on waves of clicking cameras, raised voices, and pounding footsteps. The air carried the scent of freshly scrawled chalk and protest, echoing against ivy-covered walls that had long welcomed quiet complicity. Beside the students, custodial staff, janitors, night attendants, maintenance workers, gathered. Their uniforms were stained by hours of labor, their faces lined with years of tedium, but today they stood straight, no chants, no signs, just present. Their solidarity said more than slogans ever would, that silence had protected injustice too long, and now even the shadows were speaking. Inside the hall the mood was brittle. Senior professors in dark jackets whispered to one another, shifting papers like shields. Young lecturers leaned forward, eyes wide, some biting their lips, others shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. The front seats, reserved for authority, seemed to tremble beneath the weight of truth. The seat marked Dr. William Carrington sat conspicuously empty. Though his name was on the plaque, his absence reverberated louder than any accusation. At the center, Dean Henry Kessler stood behind the podium, his posture tight, as though he carried not just the university's reputation, but its fate. Malik Simmons sat near the front, inconspicuous in his worn hoodie and sneakers, notebook folded in his lap like a shield against doubt. Around him the room pulsed with tension, a thermostat stuck at fear and expectation. Dean Kessler cleared his throat softly, the click echoing in the hush. "We gather today under extraordinary circumstances," he began. His voice was steady, but the echoes carried strain. "Recent developments have brought to light evidence that challenges not just individual conduct, but the core principles on which this institution stands." He paused, letting that weight settle. Audio recordings, academic logs, internal communications, and handwritten documentation have been submitted and verified. Eyes flicked across professors, some afraid to catch his gaze. "This meeting is not about defending tradition," he went on, "but about reaffirming truth. We must decide whether we stand for legacy or for justice." The first murmurs rose then, soft, cautious. One elderly professor, voice raspy, spoke. "With respect, Dean, are we prepared to adjudicate brilliance based on a student who isn't enrolled? Where does this leave our admission standards? Our policy?" The question dripped with concern, Not for Malik, but for precedent. A younger lecturer, hands clasped tight, shot back. If we protect policies over people, we've already failed. We're not here to uphold a system. We're here to uphold honesty. The clash wasn't loud. It was quiet, but seismic. Walls of institutional privilege groaned. Glasses clinked. Papers shuffled. The custodians outside braced themselves. The students leaned in, silent but waiting. Malik's heart hammered, not with fear but with clarity. This wasn't just about one moment of genius. This was about whether this campus still belonged to truth or to silence. Voices came from unexpected corners now. A junior black sociology professor, usually reserved, spoke with controlled passion. This isn't about protocol or enrollment. It's about recognition. We lionize legacy. We rewrite history, but we ignore talent when it shows up scuffed and late, carrying supplies instead of resumes. That ends today. There was a stir, heads turned, paper rustled. A middle-aged woman near the back reached out, placing her hand on Malik's worn jacket. Subtle, but tangible. It was enough. The tide shifted. Outside the hall, the murmurs rose to chants again. Students stood shoulder to shoulder with custodians. A quiet unity spread across the lawns and bleachers. Their collective breath formed a pulse, the campus heartbeat reawakening. Overhead, birds circled. Somewhere a horn honked. It felt like the walls themselves were leaning in, listening. Inside, as arguments ebbed and flowed with cautious ferocity, Dean Kessler lifted his hands for calm. Silence reclaimed the room. His eyes settled on Malik, then drifted across the faces of those seated, some resolute, some trembling. He took a breath. We are choosing between protecting privilege and protecting truth, he said quietly. We are deciding whether brilliance can survive here, regardless of origin. Another pause. Then he raised his hand. A hush fell, heavier than before. Papers dropped. Breath held. Eyes locked. And as the silence stretched, Malik felt time still, as though the world had paused to watch. From the back of the room, a soft rustle. Someone closed a folder. Chairs creaked. Then, from the quietest corner, a voice, soft, steady but reverberating against the walls, whispered, "What we do now matters." The dean nodded, slowly. He looked at the faces around him. Faculty, custodians, students. Malik, his mouth opened, as if to speak, to deliver a verdict that would echo across corridors, dormitories, lecture halls and admin offices both now and for decades to come. He exhaled, lifted both hands slightly, and said in a voice that shook with gravitas, "What I'm about to announce will change this institution forever." The auditorium held its breath, waiting. The hush in the grand lecture hall snapped like a brittle wire the moment Harvard University's dean raised his hand and spoke the verdict out loud. For nearly a minute, the room felt suspended. Chairs creaked, breaths held, eyes locked on thin air. Then came the ripple, incredulous gasps, shaky exhalations. A few tears in the front row. The dean's words hit like thunder. Malik's work was declared genuine. His solution validated. His notebook accepted as authentic proof of long-term self-driven scholarship. More. The university acknowledged that access to opportunity had been wrongfully denied to him. They offered a full scholarship, retroactive access to library and academic resources, and formally apologized, not just to Malik, but to his mother and all custodial staff. Across the lectern, the seat placeholder for Dr. William Carrington remained empty, a void heavy with implication, a symbol of accountability that many thought would never be demanded. The announcement closed with a commitment. Harvard would launch a review aimed at dismantling institutional barriers for undocumented brilliance, anyone who had been overlooked due to background rather than judged on merit. And in that moment, corridors that had long echoed with indifference vibrated with possibility. Outside the hall, the campus erupted. Students poured into the quadrangle and stairwells, voices merging into a chorus of solidarity. Painted chalk slogans from earlier protests were magnified, newly contextualized as declarations of truth, rather than fleeting sloganeering. Custodial staff, some still in uniform, stood among undergraduates and graduate students' ilex, eyes glittering with cautious hope. Parents of some students, drawn by frantic phone calls, drifted in, defining their own silent stand beside families like Malik's. In the heart of it all, Malik sat quietly at the fringe, hoodie creased, shoes dusty, absorbing the scene like one emerging from deep water, blinking against the light. He felt honor clinging to him and gravity trying to settle. both at once. When a senior professor offered him his spot in an honors seminar, the gesture was so genuine, so unguarded, that Malik's throat tightened. The offer came without strings, no media appearances, no diversity quotas, just a chance to learn. For the first time, he considered the future not as a question, but as a possibility. News of the decision spread rapidly beyond campus gates. The student-run newspaper ran a front-page headline, "Janitor's son named scholar." National publications followed. Think pieces lauding it as proof talent, transcends background, social justice blogs calling it a victory for merit, and op-eds from alumni offering restrained praise. On social media, hashtags celebrating brilliance without privilege trended for days. Donations poured in from anonymous benefactors, scholarships offered by private foundations, messages of support from mathematicians, engineers, even artists. For many, Malik became a symbol, hope distilled into one person. But not everyone celebrated. Underneath threads of support, trolls re-emerged. Some called him a token, insisted his scholarship was a publicity stunt. Others questioned whether Harvard had lowered standards for a viral moment. A handful even accused the institution of hypocrisy, pointing out that his overnight elevation didn't erase a lifetime of being ignored. One anonymous post mocked his scholarship as a one-time pity grant, and implied his presence would tarnish the value of what real students earn. The backlash grew steadily, not with threats, but with whispers and undermining rhetoric, people debating among themselves whether this was progress or pandering. For the first time, Malik understood what surviving success might look like, not just overcoming ignorance but enduring disbelief. Meanwhile, the consequences for Carrington moved faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours of the verdict, multiple former students, overlooked over the years, came forward. Some admitted they had dabbled in plagiarism, or half-finished proofs that Carrington had dismissed harshly. Others brought emails where they'd pleaded for fair evaluation, but had been ignored. The manila folder Heather Crane presented had only scratched the surface. The new complaints revealed patterns, grade changes, withheld research opportunities, nepotistic favors tied to donor influence, institutional loyalty cracked. Departments issued quiet statements distancing themselves from him. A few old colleagues who had once nodded along now looked away in hallways. By the next morning, Carrington's name had become toxic. No lecture halls were willing to host his courses. Under pressure, and with reputation in tatters, he submitted his resignation. The departmental chair accepted it at once, citing irreparable damage to academic integrity. No farewell lecture aired, no farewell emails circulated. In one sweeping gesture, the empire built on prejudice collapsed, and Malik's victory became a reckoning not just for him, but for everyone who had benefited from silence. Yet the aftermath was not simple redemption, and Malik felt the weight keenly. He was offered the scholarship, yes, but with a dozen conditional forms, background checks, interviews, and a mentorship assignment tagged as support for underprivileged scholars. Someone even suggested an institutional spotlight interview, charity for optics, subtle but visible. The custodial staff who had nodded in solidarity began avoiding his path through supply corridors. Some avoided eye contact. One older janitor, usually silent but kind, muttered in passing, "They'll forget you tomorrow," as if fear and habit were winning again. Malik realized that respect, the kind that came with sincerity, was far harder than victory. Headlines fade, scholarship paperworks expire, but changing minds, that took years. Still, the offer stood. Doors opened. Invitations came, but each step forward carried the ache of past erasures. He wanted to believe in change, but he couldn't ignore the lingering hesitation in their eyes. The final blow of the day came quietly. As dusk approached, Malik and his mother left the campus grounds together. She carried a small duffel bag filled with cleaning supplies, not because she was going back to work, but because she still wore the uniform, still walked the halls that remained her domain. Malik's scholarship acceptance letter, now signed and framed, rested in his backpack. Cars honked, bicycle bells rang, students streamed out of classes, laughter filling the air with casual normalcy. Through it all, Malik sensed more than relief. He sensed fragility. He crossed the street, glanced back at the campus gates, the old stone buildings bathed in golden sunset light, dorm windows glowing softly. In that glance was everything he felt: triumph, confusion, longing, and a sudden uncertainty. Would the respect he was offered survive the next scandal, the next rumor, the next quiet dismissal masked as policy? Could brilliance truly belong to someone who had spent years hidden behind mops and closets? His mother didn't speak. She fell silent with tired relief, her worn sneakers echoing softly on the pavement. Malik opened his backpack just once, to tuck the scholarship letter over his heart, as if sealing a promise. As they hailed a cab, the city lights flickered on, and the driver nodded in greeting, unaware of the storm that had passed just behind them at Harvard's gates. As Malik and his mother settled into the back seat, Malik glanced back at the campus one last time, uncertain, determined, and holding his breath, wondering if respect would ever feel real. The early autumn sun filtered through the leaves of the campus quad, casting shifting golden patterns on the stone walkways, and Malik Simmons walked those paths now with a stride neither hesitant nor proud, but leveled. He was no longer the janitor's son sneaking supplies after dark. He was a student, a scholar, but the world he walked through was still textured with shadows. He passed beneath old oak arches, shoulders squared, backpack slung just right, textbooks in hand with crisp spines, an admission letter tucked inside one of them. Around him, undergraduates hustled between classes, laughing, arguing, carrying lattes and laptops. Custodial carts still rolled quietly in side halls, folding closets from his mother's realm. Some staff nodded at him. Others looked away. Some students recognized his face from the viral footage. A few nodded with respect, subtle, not loud but real. Many pretended not to notice, and in that mixture of reactions, Malik walked steady. His heart carried the recent storm, the classroom challenge, the confrontation, the vindication, but his eyes saw the present, a campus both changed and unchanged, a stage rewritten but still under construction. Inside the library, Malik settled at a corner table near the large windows that overlook the courtyard. He spread out a calculus textbook, a notebook, and a clean sheet of paper. Around him, the hush of pages turning and soft footsteps created a gentle rhythm, an academic heartbeat. A few curious glances drifted his way, but no whispers loud enough for him to hear. He flipped open his notebook and sketched a problem, not assigned but one he had devised himself, a variation on the integrals that had once changed his life. As he worked, the tension in his shoulders slowly relaxed. The shapes on the chalkboards no longer belonged only to Dr. Carrington's challenges, now they belonged to him. In that stillness he felt something like belonging. But belonging didn't come without memory. A fellow student dropped her backpack nearby and muttered softly, "I remember that video." Malik offered nothing more than a calm nod. She looked away. The library returned to silence. He closed the textbook and leaned back, exhaling slowly. For all the acceptance, there remained invisible lines, unspoken distances, subtle lifts in brows, cautious avoidance. Talent had earned him entry, but prejudice still lingered in corners where people chose to look the other way. Outside, the campus felt quieter. The crowds of protest were gone, the loud banners packed away, and the chalk slogans washed clean. Custodial closets were locked again, but the impact remained. A new scholarship fund established. A few older staff given extended contracts. A scholarship named for Malik's potential. His mother walked past him one sunny morning, uniform crisp, carrying cleaning supplies, but her eyes held something different this time. Quiet pride. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her nod said it all. Until then, their small apartment had echoed only with the sound of mops and late-night studying. Now it echoed with possibility, soft and steady. That morning after class, Malik found her standing under a campus tree, waiting for him. She held a coffee she had bought with a day off. He smiled, accepted the cup, and for a moment, just a moment, everything felt real. The scholarship letter in his backpack, the quiet respect in halls, the sense that maybe, despite everything, he belonged. Maybe. Yet as dusk approached that day, Malik felt the old tension return as a whisper in his spine. Walking across campus, he passed by an older professor he had never met. Someone whose face carried years of tradition and expectation. The professor looked at him long, then looked away quickly, avoiding eye contact. Malik caught the fleeting hesitation, a blink of discomfort, and realized that respect could be offered. But acceptance wasn't so easily given. He slowed his pace, listening to distant laughter, late classes dismissing. The golden light softened his shadows, but the memory of darker corridors lingered. Talent had opened doors, gates had swung wide, but walls, hidden walls, still stood. He pushed the thought down, focusing instead on the present, the textbooks, the quiet footfalls, the steady beat of his own breath, because hope was fragile, especially in places built on privilege for centuries. At night he sat at his desk in the small dorm room, assigned to him under the scholarship program. The window was open, a cool breeze stirring the corner of a blank sheet of paper before him. He picked up a pen, letting the nib hover just above the page. He thought of his mother's smile, the hallway where insult had once landed like a blow, the whiteboard that had become his proving ground, the faculty meeting, the crowds, the legal papers, the scholarship letter, all of it a weight and a gift. His finger pressed gently against the paper. He exhaled. In that moment, he wasn't sure if the respect he now had would hold. He wasn't sure if silence would return, maybe not from the faculty, but from peers who still believed in unspoken hierarchies. Maybe the scholarship would come with its pressures, its expectations, its gaze. Maybe the world that praised brilliance aloud would still judge quietly. But still, he dipped the pen in ink. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows across campus grounds, visible through the dorm window, Malik's hand moved. Lines of script formed on the blank page. Not equations, not proofs, but words. A new beginning in ink. A testament to the fact that survival wasn't enough. He intended to thrive. He paused after the first line, his breath even, eyes steady. Outside, the campus lights blinked on. One by one, somewhere a distant door closed. Footsteps faded away, and the night settled softly. The world outside whispered of endings and continuations, of memory and change. Malik looked at his writing. Nothing grand, nothing shouted, just a start. As he folded the fresh page with careful fingers, ready to write something new, his phone buzzed silently on the desk. He glanced down. A single notification, from an unknown number, and the screen glowed with a message. 2 words long, welcome home. If you believe brilliance should never be silenced by status, type yes in the comments. What would you have done if you saw Malik being humiliated in that courtyard? Don't forget to subscribe, because these stories aren't just entertainment, they're reminders. We speak so those who were ignored can finally be heard.